Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of the Film Etc. podcast. I'm your host, Mike Webb, and normally this is a movie review podcast, but why is this episode deemed special, you may ask? Well, we are in the season of making our year-end list, but there are also lists about the greatest films of all time. Now, websites like IMDb and Letterboxd update their list almost constantly, but for this episode, I'm focusing specifically on Sight and Sound, a magazine run by the BFI, where every 10 years they ask filmmakers, film critics, professionals, and other film enthusiasts from around the world to participate in a poll where they give their picks on what they believe are the top 10 greatest films of all time. They are then compiled and tabulated in a top 100 list based on however many votes each film gets. I can't wait to talk to you guys about it. I'm going to tell you all about the history of the Sight and Sound greatest films of all time poll. Tell you guys the last poll that came out in the past decade, what my picks should be had I participated in this list, and reveal to you all the updated list that will be announced later today. So, without further ado, let's get this list making episode underway. Now, to give you guys a little bit of a heads up for those of you who are new to the show or basically need a little bit of refresher, I am diagnosed with autism, so I'm not great with conversing with other people in general. So you may hear my wording sound a bit off or something like that. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening. Sight and Sound is a monthly film magazine published by the British Film Institute, or BFI for short, and since the year 1952, they have conducted a poll every 10 years by asking a group of international film professionals such as critics, filmmakers, professors, enthusiasts, etc., to vote for their picks for what they believe are the 10 greatest films of all time, and then their picks are then tabulated into a combined top 100 list based on however many votes each film gets. The late great film critic Roger Ebert has described it as, quote, by far the most respected of the countless polls of great movies, the only one most serious movie people take seriously, close quote. In its inaugural poll, the film that was deemed the greatest film of all time was Vittorio De Sica's Italian neorealism masterpiece Bicycle Thieves, which at the time came out a few years prior to the making of this list. The other films that were in the top 10 had a couple of ties and one three-way tie. Tied for second place were the Chaplin classics City Lights and The Gold Rush. Number 4 was Battleship Potemkin. A tie in fifth place between D.W. Griffith's Intolerance and Louisiana Story. I'm pretty sure no one's heard of that movie. No one's talking about that movie today. Another tie in seventh place between Eric von Stroheim's Greed, another movie no one talks about, Le Jour se lève, which is a Marcel Carné film. Marcel Carné is the director of Children of Paradise, and Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. And we have a three-way tie for 10th place between David Lean's Brief Encounter, which is one of my favorite doomed romance movies of all time, directed by David Lean, and then two French comedies, The Rules of the Game from Jean Renoir and Les Millions from René Clair, which I recently watched Les Millions on the Watch TCM app, and it's a fun movie. Very straightforward in terms of story, but I laughed and was moved throughout. There are songs in the movie as well. One of them has been stuck in my head ever since. They're like, Millionaire, Millionaire. But yeah, it's a fun movie if you want to check it out, Les Millions. But one of the films that was declared as a runner-up in the inaugural 1952 list later took the number one spot for the next 5 decades, starting in 1962, and that is Orson Welles' directorial debut, Citizen Kane, from 1941. Until 1992, the list consisted of critics and directors to make one combined list, but nowadays, directors have been invited to participate in a separate poll, and now we have both a critic's top 10 list, top 100 list, and a director's top 100 list. Now, I love to create lists, top 10s, rankings, whatever you want to call them. They're just so much fun to create. It doesn't have to be year-end or all-time lists every single time. You could do a specific genre, favorite actor, a brand like A24 or Disney, or something particularly random out of the blue. And then you have to figure out which movie would you declare on your top and then just your runners up. Probably within the start of the new year, I'll be doing an episode dedicated to the films that came out this year, both good and bad. And I know some people think if you do a worst of list, that means you're terrible. But I feel like it's my job to remind you that you should avoid those movies at all costs. But anyway, let's get back to lists in general. Not all lists are created equal because there's usually some movies you yourself don't tend to agree with the rest of, and that's totally fair. And opinions change every day on a movie in particular. The IMDb top 250 and the Letterboxd 250 highest rated films cannot be more different than each other. IMDb's number one of all time is The Shawshank Redemption, which is a great prison drama from '94 with Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, and that is considered by many to be one of the greatest movies ever made, mainly because it did not do so well at the box office. It just like had a bunch of like reruns on television from like TBS and TNT. That movie is played on all the time. And then Letterboxd's number one is the 1980s Russian World War II drama Come and See, which is perhaps the most brutally harrowing, disturbing movie ever made. Ugh. Like that was like a tough movie to sit through. But outside of those lists, there were some recent ones that threw me in for a loop and caused a bit of stir online. Another British magazine known as Empire made an updated list on their picks for the 100 greatest films of all time. It was polled by the magazine's readers as well as their esteemed critics, and that list overall is just nothing more than a popularity contest. Their pick for the greatest film of all time is The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, which is beyond absurd. And when I looked at the rest of the list, it became baffling to the sense of whether or not people who were participating do not have a sizable education on film, and it leans more towards both a recency bias and a sense of nostalgia. About 79 films on that list, and yes, I did count, 79 films on that list were made after the year 1980. 43 of those films are from the 21st century, and 20 of them are from the last 10 years, including 7 Marvel films, where the highest ranked of them all is Avengers Infinity War. It's number 8 on that list. It's a fun movie overall, but no way is it an all timer in my book. I actually prefer Endgame over Infinity War, which Endgame is ranked number 22 on that list. And as you could probably tell, I, like many people who saw that list, were extremely upset about the lack of variety. There is not a single silent film on that list. There's also not a lot of world cinema. There's no French Wave, no Japanese films other than Seven Samurai. The oldest films on that list are Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and It's a Wonderful Life, all from the 1940s. It's only 3 of 21 films that are on that list that were made before the year 1980. And that's where you have this overwhelming majority around nostalgia. The other recent list that I was not completely happy with was the Ringers list for the 50 best romantic comedies of all time. This was a poll curated by the staff, and like the Empire list, every single film charted on that list, with the exception of Harold and Maude, was made after the year 1980. Some of my favorite rom coms of all time, a genre I'm not particularly fond of, were made long before those movies ever existed, and most of them fall into the screwball category, like the Best Picture winner It Happened One Night with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, or the ones with Cary Grant like Bringing Up Baby, The Awful Truth, and His Girl Friday. Can anyone have the decency to at least bring a little variety rather than just overfilling it with pure nostalgia in that regard? But anyway, rant over. Let's get back to the Sight and Sound, and I'm not going to go over every single poll that has been conducted. You guys can all look it up if you have any interest. For the 2012 poll, a new rule was added where films that were part of a larger narrative, like The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, the Three Colors trilogy, and the Apu trilogy, they were meant to be treated as separate films for the purposes of voting. So you cannot vote for both Godfather and Godfather Part 2 uh at the same time. You would have to like treat them separately with one another. And in that poll, that year's poll, or decades poll rather, there was an estimated 2045 films, that's a lot of movies, that received at least one mention from one of the 846 film critics that participated in that list. And here are the top results for the critics poll when it came out a decade ago. At number 10, you have Federico Fellini's 8.5. Number 9, you have Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. At number 8, you have Zika Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. You have at number 7, John Ford's The Searchers. Number 6 is Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Number 5 is Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans by F.W. Murnau. Number 4 is Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game. Number 3 is Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story. Number 2 is Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. And number 1 is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Now that was the critics poll. Now let's go over to the directors poll. I don't have like an official number on how many directors participated in the poll, but these are what these filmmakers believe are the top 10 greatest films of all time. So at number 10, like I mentioned, Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves is the number 10 spot. Number 9 is Mirror from Andrei Tarkovsky. Number 8 is Vertigo. And number 6 and 7 are two masterpieces, if you would call it, from Francis Ford Coppola, Apocalypse Now and The Godfather. Number 5 is Scorsese's Taxi Driver. 4 is 8.5. 3 is Citizen Kane. 2 is 2001: A Space Odyssey. And number 1 is Tokyo Story. So overall, a mix of almost the same stuff. 8.5, Tokyo Story, 2001, and Vertigo appeared on both lists. Now, I'm going to be perfectly clear, and I've said this in a previous episode. I am not the biggest fan of Hitchcock's Vertigo. Like, the filmmaking overall is fascinating, but its story and character development are it just left me feeling icky. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation. And I don't think Vertigo deserves a pick. Like, I get how serious the Sight and Sound magazine greatest of all time poll is, but to me, Vertigo is not an all-timer. It's probably my least favorite Hitchcock of the ones that I've seen so far. But yeah, that's just a whole nother conversation that I'll just like throw out of the way. I could do a whole entire episode on Vertigo, whether I'd want to or not. Now, before we get into the updated list, why don't I tell you all my personal picks for the greatest movies of all time, in my opinion, in alphabetical order. And if I were to just rank these, it would just be very, very complicated or something like that. And I don't want to go for like movies that are just like considered like my favorites, but I would just like consider it like in terms of filmmaking and story and structure and tone and all that jazz. So I'm going to start off with a movie that starts with C. Now, some of you may be thinking it's Citizen Kane or something like that. You might think, but you're not. Although Citizen Kane is one of my runners up, but I'm actually going to go with Charlie Chaplin's City Lights, which is probably my favorite of all the Chaplin films. I love Chaplin. It's between him, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd as like the three greatest silent film stars of all time. I like Chaplin overall, mainly whenever it's like his short films like Payday or A Dog's Life or Shoulder Arms, which is a World War One short film, which is pretty significant, or some of his like feature film length ones like The Gold Rush, which I mentioned was featured on the inaugural list, or The Kid, which is kind of a heartbreaker, or The Circus, or Modern Times, or The Great Dictator. But I'm going to go with City Lights. That movie came out around the time when silent movies are dying down and talkies have become the new normal. It still has like some sound bits, but just like played for laughs, and it's fun. It's a rom-com. It's just so sweet and tender and unabashedly funny throughout. So yeah, I'm gonna put City Lights at number 1 in alphabetical order. My number 2 pick is Coppola's The Godfather from 1972, one that I just mentioned on the director's poll. Yeah, I know it's kind of cliche to add it, but you could see why it's one of the greatest movies of all time. It's based on the book of the same name by Mario Puzo. It chronicles the Corleone family from 1945 to 1955. We're mainly focused on two of its members, Patriarch Vito, played by Marlon Brando, and his youngest son, Michael, played by Al Pacino. Why am I even telling you all about the plot of The Godfather? Everyone has seen The Godfather. Well, except my mom, but she needs to get on it. Everything that hasn't been said great about this movie has been said already. It redefined the gangster film genre as we know it. It became a culture phenomenon, and it has cemented itself in the pantheon of all things film. If you haven't watched The Godfather yet, go and watch it. You'll be glad you did. Number 3, I would hope that this would be added to this updated list, and that is Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love that came out back in 2000. It is such a beautiful movie, and it's a romance movie that doesn't typically play out like in your usual romance movie tropes. I would argue that, but yeah, beautiful movie. The color scheme, the use of slow motion, and the music, all just chef's kiss. Love the actors played by Tony Leung and Maggie Chung. They're basically a couple living in 1950s Hong Kong, and their spouses that they found out they're like they're cheating on them or something like that. Both Tony Leung's wife and Maggie Chung's husband, who we don't see on screen at all, but it's like mentioned throughout. And then they have somewhat kind of an intimate relationship, but it's lovely. And the last like shot, the last scene in the movie where um I don't want to give it away, but it's just like beautiful, something to behold. For my number four, there is only one film that has stayed in the top 10 list on every decennial poll, and that is The Rules of the Game by Jean Renoir, which is this French ensemble comedy drama of manners. According to the Wikipedia page, the film depicts members of an upper class society and their servants at an estate just before the beginning of World War II, showing their moral callousness on the eve of destruction. Even the plot alone was so shocking enough when it was first released in 1939 that it was banned in Nazi occupied France. But years after its release, it was rediscovered and reinterpreted for its style and themes, and it's perhaps to no degree the most influential film of all time. If you haven't checked out The Rules of the Game yet, do yourself a favor and watch it. Number five, Seven Samurai from Akira Kurosawa. This is like the modern template to what we have with like the team up movies nowadays. Like this is the movie that was remade in America as The Magnificent Seven. And yeah, again, the team up movie. We would later have movies like The Wild Bunch and the superhero movies like X-Men and the Avengers. It's all based on this template from Seven Samurai. It's about a couple villagers who find out that their village is being robbed by these bandits, if you would call it that, and then they like go across uh, the country to look for these samurai to help protect their village. It's a 3.5 hour long movie. It flies by. It does not drag one single bit. It is incredible. My number six is a movie that is a very recent movie on this list, probably the most recent movie on this list. That is David Fincher's The Social Network. When this movie came out, I was like almost a year into having a Facebook account, and I was like, this could be like very relevant and kind of revolutionary. And this movie is basically this commentary about like how the creation of Facebook came to be. You have performances from Jesse Eisenberg, Andrew Garfield, Justin Timberlake, Army Hammer, Max Minghella, a bunch of cast members that are just incredible. Rooney Mara in one scene at the very beginning is great. You have a young Dakota Johnson before people knew who she was and everything. But yeah, it's so good. The Social Network. A lot of people say like the ending is just like problematic um because of what Rashida Jones's character says to Mark Zuckerberg at the very end. And I was like, well, in terms of like the context, like what the movie was trying to go for at the time, but nowadays when you get to find out what Mark Zuckerberg has done since, you kind of like, you know what, Rashida Jones, you kind of lied to us, and that's like the movie trying to like rope us into feeling a different sense of feeling for Mark Zuckerberg overall. So, but I still enjoy The Social Network as it is. The electric score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross is impeccable. The editing, the cinematography from Jeff Cronenweth, all stand out, and I love it to pieces. As much as my next film, which would be considered my second favorite movie of all time, and that is Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood from 2007. It's Daniel Day-Lewis playing a wealthy oil tycoon in the 1900s. He goes out to California with his supposed son, and they just like drill for oil. And then you have this family. Their son is this like preacher of this like unorthodox church, I would call it that. But yeah, it is epic, it is grand, it is beautiful. Again, the cinematography, the score by Johnny Greenwood, the production design, the editing, it's all immaculately made, and yet it's so long. It's like almost 3 hours long, and it's deliberately paced. I will give it that. But yeah, I just love There Will Be Blood to pieces. My number eight pick, there has been a movie trilogy that I watched pretty recently, and it just like changed my life for the better. And that is Krzysztof Kieslowski's The Three Colors trilogy. And because of the 2012 rule where you can only pick one separate entry if you're doing like a larger narrative. Even though Three Colors Blue is a close second, I'm ended up going with Three Colors Red because all three of these movies, they just like resemble like the French flag between blue, white, and red. White is probably my least favorite, but it's still pretty good. Blue is a close second because both blue and red are immaculately well made. Because blue, it centers on Juliette Binoche's character who loses her family members in a car accident, and she just like wants to like, I don't know, restart, give up everything she has, and just like move to Paris. For Red, we focus on a model played by Irene Jacob, and she ends up forming this friendship with a former judge played by the late great Jean-Louis Trintignant, who passed away earlier this year. And yeah, and then with Red, it just like connects all the stories together towards the very end, and it's incredible. So yeah, Three Colors Red. It was Kieslowski's final film that he made before he passed away in '96. Three Colors Red came out in '94, the year before I was born, surprisingly, and it got a couple Oscar nominations, and I can see why. People love the Three Colors trilogy. I love both blue and red. White is good, but it's nowhere near like the top of like what blue and red do. It is timeless, I will say. My number 9 pick, I've told everyone many, many times what my favorite movie of all time is. It is Sidney Lumet's 12 Angry Men. It's his directorial debut from 1957. Every time I get asked what the movie is about, it's kind of complicated for me to like explain the story. But 12 Angry Men, it cannot be more simpler. It's about 12 jurors who are in court and are trying to figure out whether or not this this Puerto Rican teenage boy is guilty of committing murder. And everyone but one juror, played by Henry Fonda, says the boy is guilty. But then throughout the movie, Henry Fonda is trying to convince the other jurors in the room, one by one, to change their vote. And it is great. Great ensemble. I mentioned Henry Fonda, but also Lee J. Cobb as juror number 3, or I want to say. You also have John Fielder, the voice of Piglet, in there. You have Ed Begley Sr., a bunch of other people, but it's just too much to name. But yeah, I love how it's just like mostly in the juror room, and throughout the movie, you're just like, this is just like acting powerhouses, just like pulling it off. It's basically a play put on film, and what else can I say? It's incredible. 12 Angry Men. If you have not watched any of these movies that I've mentioned, then do yourself a favor and watch them. There you could see why, in terms of filmmaking, in terms of story, in terms of tone and everything, why I love these movies to pieces. And then number 10, I just want to put in like a childhood classic of mine, and that is The Wizard of Oz from 1939, directed by Victor Fleming, based on the novel by L. Frank Baum. It's one of those movies, along with like the Disney Renaissance movies of the 90s, where I just like grew up watching over and over again. All those movies and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, but Wizard of Oz, definitely I would put this like in my top 10 greatest of all times. Yeah, The Wizard of Oz, it just like transports you to another world. It's just like the complete like definition of the fantasy world and all that stuff. But yeah, Judy Garland is amazing. Frank Morgan, Ray Bolger, Burt Lahr, Jack Haley, Billy Burke, Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West, all amazing. The songs still timeless to this very day. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, still timeless to this very day. It and the transition from sepia tone to color still holds up. Just so, it's just an incredible piece of art, and it does not need to be remade. I'm sorry. There is talks of remaking The Wizard of Oz. It does not need to be remade. No way. The 1939 Wizard of Oz, and some people can defend The Wiz as well, but Wizard of Oz still hands down just like sets the just sets the mold of what storytelling can be. You could show it to little kids as well. They could be scared by it, but that's like the beauty of watching a movie. Like I recently watched The Fablemans, and at the beginning, there's this young kid playing the lead role of Sam Fableman. His parents take him to see, of all movies, Greatest Show on Earth, and it cuts to and they showcase on the scene where there's a train involved, and he is just like scarred by it, and to like calm him over to like make him get rid of his fear, he just like recreates that scene with a train tracks and his father's camera so that it can help it helps become therapeutic for him or something like that. And I hope a movie like Wizard of Oz does something like that as well. So yeah, those are my picks for the top 10 greatest movies of all time. I'll recap them for you. I have City Lights, The Godfather, In the Mood for Love, The Rules of the Game, Seven Samurai, The Social Network, There Will Be Blood, Three Colors Red, 12 Angry Men, and The Wizard of Oz. Now, I know there has been some criticism with the sight and sound, mainly for a couple things. Like, and this is pretty common with lists nowadays. There's going to be this influx of recent films that could ultimately shoot to the top of the list. Like, I heard a rumor that David Lynch's Mulholland Drive could wind up in the top 20, and like the last poll that they did, both Mulholland Drive and Yee Yee were the only films from the turn of the century to be included on that list. And some people are like, it's just recent films and just like all that stuff. And now I know some of you are already saying, but Mike, if Sight and Sound adds recent movies to the list, then why were you hating on Empire's list for having all these recent movies? Now, look, to be fair, I get some of these movies may be well loved and respected by everyone, but movies like Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, and Return of the Jedi, right? Why is Return of the Jedi in the top 100? That just bothers me. Sure, they may be fun to watch, but when you look at the narrative in a different context, it's kind of problematic. But that's a whole other conversation. Not a single animated movie is on Sight and Sound's list. None of the Disney classics are on there. Not even Studio Ghibli movies like Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke are on that list. But I hope this updated list at least has some recognition towards animation. So far, only 3 films in general have the distinction to be crowned the greatest film of all time by Science Sound Magazine: Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, Citizen Kane, and Vertigo. Will there be a new entry to take over this position? Will Citizen Kane reclaim the top spot, or will Vertigo remain number one? I would love to see Citizen Kane become number one again, but if Hitchcock's Vertigo remains number one, we're going to have a problem. But now, let's get to this updated list right after this transition. Hey guys, editing Mike right here. If you guys want to check out both the critics poll and the director's poll from the Sight and Sound, I'm actually going to leave links in the episode's description wherever you get your podcast feed. So I hope you all check them out, and thanks for listening. All right, guys, the updated lists have been revealed, and the number of critics voted has nearly doubled, with 1,639 film critics participating in the poll. And the number one ranked film on Sight and Sound's poll for 2022 is the 1975 Belgian French film Jean Dielman. From the looks of it, it's spelled Jean Dielman, but it's pronounced Jean Dielman. Jeannedieelman. It is written and directed by the late Chantal Akerman. This film is one that many snooty film snobs would consider this movie to be an all-timer. It's a 3-hour movie about the life of a mother and how it like works and all that stuff. This is one where I've not seen this yet, so I can't comment on it, but this is one where you have to be like extremely patient. Do not have your phone on while you're watching it. Do not even look at your phone. Just like turn your phone off, or at least that's what some people have said. It was ranked number 35 on the poll last decade, and it has now surged to the top, becoming the 4th film to do so, and the first film to be directed by a woman to top the list. So that's pretty cool. So let's look at the critics poll. I should have said this up front. This is the top of the critics poll, but let's look at the critics poll real quick. I'm going to count it down 10 through 1. Number 10 is Singing in the Rain from 1952, directed by Stanley Donen and Gene Kelly. Number 9 is Ziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera. Number 8 is David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. I said there was a rumor that it could like be in like the top 20. It's number 8. Mulholland Drive from 2001. Number 7 is Beau Travail from 1999, a French film from the female filmmaker Claire Denis. And that recently got like a 4K restoration from the Criterion Collection. Number 6 is Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, still hanging in there. Number 5, I am very happy to report that Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love from 2000 is on the list. Number 4 is Ozu's Tokyo Story. Number 3 is Citizen Kane from Orson Welles. Number 2, Hitchcock's Vertigo. Oh, I'm so mad. It was this close to dethroning the number one pick, which is, well, it was this close to reclaim the number one or remain the number one pick, but alas, it didn't. The pick now goes to Jean Dielman from Chantal Ackerman from 1975. It is your new number one greatest film of all time, according to Sight and Sound magazine. And then there's the director's poll, where major filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Bong Joon-ho, and Barry Jenkins, to name a few, have not only participated in selecting their top tens, but have also left comments on why those selected films are considered the greatest for them in regard. And all that's going to be in the latest issue of the Sight and Sound magazine. But here's the updated director's poll. We have a three-way tie for ninth place, if you would like to call it that, between Ingmar Bergman's Persona, Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, and Close Up, directed by Abbas Kiarostami. We have another three-way tie for sixth place between Hitchcock's Vertigo, Fellini's 8.5, and Tarkovsky's Mirror. A tie for fourth place between Tokyo Story and John Dielman. Number 3 is The Godfather. Number 2 is Citizen Kane. And number 1 on the director's poll is Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. So yeah, this time on both lists, 6 movies are featured in the top 10 simultaneously. We have Citizen Kane, 2001, Tokyo Story, John Dielman, Vertigo, and In the Mood for Love. So overall, I'm not too surprised on how it turned out in general. It looks like the continuing streak for Rules of the Game staying in the top 10 has sadly ended on the critics poll, but don't worry, it's still in the top 20. It's currently at number 13, and then in the director's poll, it's like in the top 40. In the Mood for Love, I'm very happy to see there. It is the highest charted film from the 21st century on both of those lists. In fact, 9 films from the 21st century are on the critics list, and 4 of them are from the past 10 years. But the highest charted one of them all is 2019's Portrait of a Lady on Fire from Celine Sciamma, which I still need to finish. That's ranked at number 30. You also have Jordan Peele's Get Out from 2017 and 2 Best Picture winners, Moonlight from 2016, directed by Barry Jenkins, and 2019's Parasite from Bong Joon-ho, which I'm kind of surprised by that. When I was doing my personal picks, I wasn't even thinking about movies like Get Out or Parasite because I feel like they're just too recent and still fresh in everyone's memory that I would just be like, it's still too soon. But now I'm kind of regretting not putting them on there because I would definitely put Parasite on my personal picks if I were to redo my personal picks, my top 10 picks of the greatest movies of all time. Animation fans, you'll be happy to hear that 2 Studio Ghibli films made the cut. I mentioned Spirited Away, but also My Neighbor Totoro, another Miyazaki film. So that's a big plus for all you animation geeks out there. You can all celebrate now. I failed to mention that in the previous directors poll, there were 358 that participated. Now, for the updated poll, that number has now risen to 480 directors. And there are some very notable omissions from the previous critics poll, I might add. I mentioned The Godfather earlier. Don't worry, it still plays at number 12 on the critics poll. But The Godfather Part 2, which some say is even better than the original, it fell out of the critics poll completely. It was ranked number 31 last decade. Scorsese's Raging Bull is not in the critics poll. Orson Welles' Touch of Evil not in the critics poll. Robert Bresson's Pickpocket. 3 Bergman films fell out of the critics poll, most notably The Seventh Seal from 1957 and Fanny and Alexander from 1982, which is very surprising. Not a single film from either Steven Spielberg or David Lean appears on the critics list. Luckily, if you look at the director's poll, some of the omissions I mentioned are there, so you don't have to worry about it. Like Jaws is there, Lawrence of Arabia is there, all the ones that I mentioned. But yeah, because there are some ties on both lists, the director's poll actually has more movies listed than the critics poll. There's 100 total on the critics poll, but directors have 106. I mentioned films released in the 21st century brought an influx to both lists, but there are also only 9 movies on the director's list, but only 3 from the 2010s. Both Moonlight and Parasite are on there, but the other one is the 2011 Iranian film A Separation from Asghar Farhadi, one that I've yet to watch. Of the movies that I made personal picks to earlier, only the first half made it onto both lists. City Lights is on both of them. Godfather, In the Mood for Love, Rules of the Game, Seven Samurai, but no love for Social Network or There Will Be Blood or Three Colors Red or 12 Angry Men or Wizard of Oz. I will say though, both lists contain a nice variety into the mix. You will get some that all these film scholars and critics think which ones are great, and the filmmakers will mostly think differently as well. As of recording this episode, we don't have an official tally on the number of votes on the films that were listed on there. There are lists from filmmakers that I've seen on social media. I mentioned Scorsese and Barry Jenkins and Bong Joon-ho, but also directors like Michael Mann and John Carpenter and Apichatpong Weerasethakul. One of my favorite lists that I saw is the Indian filmmaker S.S. Rajamouli, who directed RRR and the Bahubali films. On his would be a list I would have loved if I was like 15 years old and didn't have a whole knowledge of critiquing film. He picked Forrest Gump as his number one, a film I loved then until I looked at a different context. That movie was recently remade in India under the name Lal Singh Chaddha. Check that out if you want to like Google it or something like that. He also put Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I love, a couple animated films, including a couple from the Disney Renaissance, like The Lion King, which I grew up watching, and Aladdin. He even added Kung Fu Panda to that list, a film I was raving about when it came out when I was like 13 years old. Like all those choices I would have loved to pick when I was like in my early to mid teenage years. I don't blame his choices. I think he's made a fun list overall, and I still need to check out his film RRR. I've heard nothing but great things about it. I know it's on Netflix, but it's dubbed in Hindi instead of the original spoken language, which is Telugu. So, for final thoughts, I will say this. Some people will find the majority of this list and be like, I've never even heard of these movies until today. And you know what? Not everyone is going to watch all of these movies, and that's totally fine by me. Most people go to the movies just to escape and be completely entertained. But I feel like movies can also leave with something in mind. The beauty of some of those movies, as well as the movies that are featured on those lists that I mentioned, that once it's over, it stays with you for a very long period of time. You may even still think about that movie for weeks, even months after you first saw it, and it still resonates with you in some way. I would usually say when I first saw Come On last year, and I thought when I'm watching it's a movie about an uncle taking care of like his nephew, and then they just like go around a trip. Joaquin Phoenix plays this like documentary producer, and he goes and like interviews kids on like what the future can be, and then he takes his nephew with him along for the ride. And it basically like it made me like it just basically like how my future is going to be when I like see myself within like 5-10 years from now, and when I have to like be responsible for like my my siblings kids when they have kids, and I'm going to be like the uncle. And I was like, oh man, this is going to be like me. I walked out of the movie a blobbering mess. Like I cried, like I had to go to the bathroom just to like collect my thoughts. And from that moment on, I just like I knew nothing was going to top of that. It became my favorite film last year, and I it just like resonated with me on that level. But yeah. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this very special episode of the Film Etc. podcast. Until then, for the Sight and Sound polls, only time will tell on what's going to end up on the next list in a decade. Maybe a movie that's yet to be made will be on the list. Maybe Le Million comes back on the list next decade to celebrate its 100th anniversary, but that's not going to happen, sadly. I hope Vertigo drops out at the top 10 next time. I mean, come on. Like, I get why like people love it in terms of the filmmaking, but the story overall, just no. I don't buy it 100%. So now I'm going to end this episode, call it a day, catch up on some of these films that are on the list, and probably make more ranking lists just for the fun of it. Well, guys, that's going to do it for this special episode on this decade's Sight and Sound poll. Sight and Sound, if you're listening, I would love to participate in the next decade. If you like to invite me, it would be an honor. I will say that right now. But I'm pretty sure most of you have at least seen one of these movies. But if you're interested in like any of these movies or like tell me about it, let me know. I'm on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd at Real Mike Webb. You can also follow the show on Instagram at FilmETCcast. Make sure you subscribe and follow this show on the many places that it streams, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you name it. Leave a good rating, leave a 5-star review on our Apple Podcast page. That'll help get the show up to the top of the charts. Tell your friends, spread the word of mouth, share the show if you must. I'll be back soon with movie reviews. But until then, thanks for listening, and I will see you all at the cinema.